Hi there, my name is Joe Herman. In September, Maxon came out with a new version of Cinema 4D called Cinema 4D 2025. With it came a whole slew of enhancements and updates and revisions to the software and new features. In this video, I've chosen a handful of them to talk about that we can take a look at and see how they work. I didn't choose all of them because we'd be here for a very long time, but perhaps in the future I'll do a follow-up video or perhaps several follow-up videos because there have been a lot of enhancements, and depending on the interest in this video, I will create some more videos to explain all the features in Cinema 4D 2025. In the meantime, I've selected several of the more important ones, and we'll take a look at that here. Incidentally, if you want to follow me on the socials, here's some information where you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram. There's some of my websites. I also create music on Spotify, in case you're interested. Also, in 2013, I made an animated sci-fi movie called The Mind Machine, a 2D animated movie, but I made it on the computer. And recently, I was able to get it onto Tubi. In case you don't know what Tubi is, it's a streaming platform that is 100% free. So you can watch a lot of movies on there, and there's no subscription fee or anything like that. So I would love it if you would take a look at my movie, The Mind Machine. If you like animation and a good sci-fi story, I think you'll like it. And if you do watch it, let me know. Now let's get started with some of the important new features in Cinema 4D 2025. Now, while this video is about Cinema 4D 2025, it is important to point out that Cinema 4D 2024 was released earlier this year, and with it came a brand new and exciting particle system. The new particle system allows you to do all kinds of really cool stuff in it that you really couldn't do before. And you really can create an amazing amount of different particle effects and particle simulations that can really knock your socks off. We can talk about the new particle system for hours, maybe even days, and maybe one day we'll do that. And now, in Cinema 4D 2025, there have been some exciting new additions and modifications to the particle system. So let's take a look at what those are. Let's begin by looking at this example. Here we see a wine bottle with a stream of particles coming out of the top of it and following a circuitous path in 3D space and ending up inside of the wine glass on the other side. This is done by a brand new modifier in the particle system called Follow Spline. So let's take a look at how we can create this effect using the new Follow Spline modifier in Cinema 4D 2025. So here's the scene, and you can see that it's made out of a wine bottle and a glass here. And there's a spline that's going from the top of the wine bottle into the glass. And that spline was just sort of made with the spline tool, and you can go ahead and make any sort of kind of spline that you want. Basically, you know, it's just basically a spline. So, Bezier spline. So, but there's nothing really that special about it. And here, this is where it is. It's just called spline. Okay. Now, on the top of the wine bottle is a particle emitter. Okay, actually I'll just click it right here. It's called basic emitter, and it's just a basic emitter. And you can sort of, it's a circle, but if you want, you can make it a rectangle, or you could make it a sphere, or anything else you want to, you know, make it at that point. But we're just going to keep it as a circle. And basically, every emitter has a particle group assigned to it. You could rename these emitters and particle groups, but if you look inside of the basic emitter under its properties, you'll see that there's a group in here. And what group is it? It's this particle group. Okay, the power of particle groups is that you can have many different emitters in your scene doing different things, and each emitter has a particle group, and you can then, if I uncollapse this particle group, you see there are modifiers in here. Okay, basically different modifiers in here, and these modifiers only work on this particle group. So you can have another emitter with its own particle group that contains its own modifiers. And in this way, different particles can be doing different things based on whichever modifiers are in their own particle groups. You can also send particles from one group to another, where different things take place. So you can start particles in one group and then send them to another group. So there's a lot of power here in this particle emitters and particle groups. Any modifiers that sit outside of a particle group, like this one right here, will then affect all of the particles in the scene. So I'm going to go ahead and disable these particle modifiers that I've created before. So what's happening right now is that if I were to press play, you can see that just a lot of particles are being shot out of this emitter. Okay, if you want to know how many particles are being shot out, it's 15,000 particles per second. Okay, and under properties you can see that the speed is at 100. Okay, so that's all well and fine. You've got these particles going on, but what I want them to do is I want these particles to be following this spline. So therefore I want to create a follow spline modifier, and that is something that is new in Cinema 4D 2025. So to create a follow spline modifier, you would just go to the simulate menu under particles, and we can see that everything that is important in dealing with particles is found in this section right here. You can create emitters, such as the basic emitter, but there's also a mesh emitter, which allows you to create particles from objects rather than just a circle or a rectangle. You can emit them from like anything, like a character if you want, or a head. You can emit from a spline. So there's all kinds of emitters here. Here's where some things that have to do if you want to create extra particle groups or multi-groups. Conditions are really powerful because you can test particle conditions. For example, you can check the velocity of a particle and do things with faster particles instead of slower particles. Or if particles enter a field, you can create a field condition. There's a time condition. You can check the age of a particle or where you are in the animation. And then here are all the modifiers, and there's a lot here, but somewhere in this list is this follow spline modifier, and that's what's new in Cinema 4D 2025. So if I were to let go here, you can see that I've created a follow spline modifier, but I'm going to delete that one, okay, because I already created one here. So basically I'm going to enable it. Now the thing is that it tells you that it wants a target spline. If I were to delete this one, let me clear it actually. You would just go ahead and this spline here that you've created, you would just go ahead and the follow spline modifier, you would just drag this spline inside of where it says target spline. And now it's in there. So now if I were to rewind it and if I were to press play, now the particles are not just shooting up and away into outer space, but they're actually following the particles. And they're following it somewhat how should I say, somewhat exactly, but it's a little bit off, and that can be controlled with this mix amount. So for example, what if we were to lower this mix amount to something like negative, or something like 40 or something instead of 50, you can see that, or let's lower it more to about 32 or something, or 31. You can see that the spline has less of a, it has a different, it follows the spline more loosely, and different parts of the spline, affect the particles in different ways, and they split off from it in different ways. And that can be something that you might like actually as an effect, for your particle path. But in this case, I don't want to do that, so I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to leave the mix back to where we were saying, which was at 50. Okay, and in this way, the particles are a lot more following the spline more precisely. If I were to slide this up, then it would really sort of be right on the spline, but that's okay. I like it a little bit loose. The next thing that we've created, by the way, I've already told you that all the particle stuff is found here, but something that is also important in particles is this, the forces. Okay, and one of these forces is turbulence. So if I add a turbulence here, and I've already created it, so I won't bother creating it. I've already created and dragged it into its particle group. We can create sort of like this effect, so I'm going to enable it right now. First, let me stop this, let me rewind it, and we're going to enable the turbulence, and let's press play. So let's go ahead, and you can see that now it's the particles are a lot more interesting as far as how they're actually moving through the scene. Okay, you can see here that it's not just this tube of particles, but it's kind of like a beautiful thing that's happening. As far as you can make it look like a design element, or if you want, you can make it look kind of like a magic spell or some sort of a wizard's, you know, thing or something like that, whatever you want it to do. But that's what turbulence is, and you can control, this is nothing new in Cinema 4D, you control the strength of the turbulent, the scale, and the frequency to just get the look you want. The third thing that I did, which is also not new in Cinema 4D 2025, but it was around in Cinema 4D 2024, and when the new particle system came out, is this color mapper. And what the color mapper does is it just maps the colors of the particles and in this case it's mapping their age from the lower amount is at 0 and the higher amount is when the particles achieve 304 frames of age. Then the thing ends. So, and basically what's happening is that the colors are cycling through this gradient. And if you change any of these colors or any of these gradient, then that would be reflected inside of the particle colors. Like, for example, if I were to make this 150 instead, now you can see that it reaches the end of the gradient at 150, which is right around here halfway through, and that's when they sort of become red, and then they sort of stay red until it hits the very bottom. But there's a lot of other really important things here. So for example, you can do the velocity of the particles. So the faster moving particles would be a different color than the slower moving particles. Maybe, you know, you might want to do that, or different things too, angular velocity and so on and so forth. And the size of the particles can be different colors. The smaller ones can be different colors than the larger ones, so on and so forth. So, and if you don't like this gradient, you can always, you know, choose another gradient here or make your own gradient. Okay, but like I said, that's actually not new in Cinema 4D 2024. The only thing that is new is this Follow Spline, and the cool thing about it is that, you know, it's live. So for example, if you were to go to the spline here and you know, select a point on this spline here, for example one of these points or whatever, you'll see that it is live. So if you move it to here, it'll just follow whatever spline thing that you want. Okay, so we'll just move it back to where it was. And that is the Follow Spline modifier. Let's take a look at something else in the Follow Spline modifier. It's called a rail. Okay, so you might ask yourself, what is the rail for? Okay, to understand the rail spline feature in the Follow Spline modifier, let's take a look at this file. In it, you've got a emitter. This is it right here, a basic emitter, and it's in the shape of a rectangle, and I've sort of scaled it so that way it's a kind of a extreme looking rectangle. It certainly doesn't look like a square anymore. And basically in its particle group right here, I've got a Follow Spline modifier here. So basically, and in the Follow Spline modifier here, I've dragged this spline right into there. Okay, so if I hit play right now, we can see that these particles come out and they follow the spline. There it is. Okay, so the thing is that basically if I were to go ahead and click somewhere on this point of the spline and sort of drag it down. Now the particles follow it down there. Okay, so it's just basically a basic follow spline type of thing right here. But if I were to stop this and rewind it, okay, there's another spline here called a rail spline, and if I were to show you what it looks like, it kind of like weaves around the first spline. So you can see it there. Okay, so basically, like I said before, our particles are basically following the inner spline, or the white spline in this case. Okay, but I can use this other spline to affect the way these particles follow that spline, and I'll show you how to do that now. In the rail field here, in this follow spline modifier for this emitter here, okay, I'm going to drag in what's called the rail spline. It's another spline. It's this other spline that wraps around the first spline. And now if I were to hit play, we can see that it causes the other particles that are following the spline to behave differently. We can see that it's like this edge wants to follow that spline. So with these rail splines, you can create all kinds of interesting movements, as you would, for example, make your splines follow these splines, and you can sort of twirl them around in space. If you want this to go faster, by the way, you can up this follow strength here. You can see now my particles are moving faster. Okay, so we can see the effect of that rail spline on our particles. It's apparent, really. Take a look at this edge here and how it always wants to follow where the rail spline is. Of course, you can add some turbulence to this and other effects as well, other forces and effects to make it more interesting. But that is the effect of the rail spline. Now, let me play this again, and let me switch to point mode, and let me click on the rail spline. Because what I can do, for example, is you can, like, for example, if you were to take this out to here, let's say, you see that you've kind of, some of the particles on the edges of this particles are not being affected by the follow spline modifier, because the rail spline is pulling them away too far. So what I can do, for example, is I can go back to the follow spline modifier, and I can up the let's try to up the effect radius to be bigger, and now we can see that sort of reins them in and stops them from being, splitting away and off of the spline too much. So that is the rail spline feature of the follow spline modifier. Let's take a look at this file here where we have a spline and an emitter. Okay, and basically let's go ahead and hit play, and we can see that the particles are coming out of the emitter, which is this right here, and here's its particle group, and it has a follow spline modifier in there, and I also have a bit of turbulence in there, but that really doesn't matter. But anyway, we can see that some of the particles are following this spline, but others are sort of like outside of its purview. And basically what we can do in order to get all the particles to follow the spline is, we took a look at this before, is we can increase its effect radius. And now basically all of the particles follow the spline. Okay, but what happens, for example, let me turn off this thing and let me show what's in this null here. Okay, now we basically have the same setup really. We have this emitter here, okay, and it has a particle group here. It's the same two things. There's a follow spline and a turbulence. But the spline, though, is made out of two segments that are not connected. Okay? And this can be useful to you. Okay? Because you can have splines that emanate all from one point, almost like, different tracks of splines, but they don't have to be connected. And what happens is that you can create a lot of interesting effects that way as well. If we look at the spline, follow spline modifier, you'll notice that where it says segment, it wants to go to the closest segment. Okay, the particles will always want to go to the closest segment. So let's take a look at what that would look like. So if I hit play, you can see that whatever splines are coming out of the emitter just want to follow the closest segment to it. And if I were to go ahead and up the effect radius, okay, it doesn't really have much of an effect actually, because they're both being controlled by those two segments. But this is an important thing to understand, that your splines don't have to be one contiguous spline. They can be spline segments, and you can achieve all sorts of interesting effects that way. Something to keep in mind. The Follow Spline modifier in the particle system is a very exciting and important new feature in Cinema 4D 2025 for sure. But now let's talk about something that is also very, very exciting in Cinema 4D 2025, and that is the addition of something called the field driver. So what is this new field driver, and what can it do? Well, many of us know what the concept of fields are in Cinema 4D, but just in case you don't, let me just quickly give you an explanation. Suppose I make a cloner, and then I make a cube, and then I make the cube really small, or somewhat small, and drag the cube in the cloner, take the cloner, okay, clone it on a grid. We'll make 75 clones on the X and 75 clones on the Z, okay, and we'll sort of drag this closer together so that way they're like 13, and we'll drag this closer together and we'll make that 13, and we can say we have just a dense array of clones on this cloner. Now if we go ahead and we add a MoGraph effector, we'll just add a plane effector, which just pops up all the clones on 100 centimeters on the y-axis. Okay, and it's just really sort of a simple thing. Now on the plane effector, we're going to go to the fields tab here, and we're just going to create one of the most basic fields that you can, which is just a spherical field. Okay, and what we'll do is we're going to remap it a little bit. First of all, what we're going to do is take its color mode, and we're going to turn that off so it's not using its color mode. And we're also going to go ahead in the field, and we are going to go ahead and change its inner offset and make its contour mode curve, and then we're going to scale it up, okay, like that. So it's a big field. So that orange thing in there is a field, okay? And the way that it works is that whatever comes in that field is going to start applying this plane effector. So for example, this plane effector starts pushing things up to 100 centimeters, and as soon as it hits sort of the center of the field, which has the most effect, okay, it's going to be up 100 centimeters. But as it passes through the field, the effect is going to be lessened, okay, because there's fall off on the field. Okay, so you can see here all these clones outside of the field are not being affected, but as soon as they start entering the field, then the plane effector is going to be affected with fall off. So that is the basic understanding of what a field is. And this is the field right here, and this is what's called a spherical field, and you can make different kinds of fields depending on what you're doing. Now, once fields were invented with really through they first started showing up with MoGraph, people started realizing how useful these things are. So you'll see fields being used in a lot of different applications within Cinema 4D. But now in Cinema 4D 2025, there comes something new under the sun. It's called the field driver. And to understand what the field driver is, let's go ahead, let's close this file, and let's create a new file here. So what is a field driver? What field drivers do is that you can control practically any parameter of anything in Cinema 4D with a field. It's kind of like fields now can be used for almost anything. So for example, let's say I were to make a cone, okay? And let's move this up a little bit, and let's go ahead to the Gouraud shading lines so we can see the lines on this cone. And you'll notice that the cone has a parameter called rotation segments, and the more we drag this rotation segments up to, let's say, whatever, the smoother the cone becomes, and the less we drag it down to, let's say, 4, now it looks like a pyramid. Okay, so let's say, just taking this parameter out of a hat, I didn't really choose this parameter for any reason, just to show that here's a random parameter that I selected. Let's say I want to control this with a field. Okay, why? Who knows? It's just to show you can control any parameter with a field now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on this parameter, and there's this new thing over here. It's called field driver. Okay, and basically you can add a field driver to this parameter. So I'm going to click add, and the first thing you'll see is that right next to the cone here, you'll see that there's a little tag on this object, and that is the field driver tag. And if I go into the parameters tab of that tag, you'll see that it says rotation segments. Okay, so that is what I'm going to be controlling here. And I want to have the minimum to be 4 and the maximum to be 32. Okay. And now for the final step, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a field. So I'm going to go to the Fields tab of the field driver tag, and I'm going to create one of the more simple fields that you can create. It's called a linear field, and it works very simply. So let's create a linear field. There it is, and here it pops up in my object browser. There it is right there. Let me just quickly drag this over to here. So here's the field. Kind of looks like a Star Wars TIE fighter or whatever. But basically the way that it works is that whatever enters the field here, anything out of here is going to have no influence. The field is not going to influence it at all. And as it enters the field, it's going to get more and more influenced by the field until it gets out on the other side. And then it's going to have 100% influence. The field is going to have 100% influence. So now if I were to take this field and drag it over my object, you'll notice that it gets more and more rotation segments until the field completely passes over it, and then it has its maximum amount, which is in this case 32. So as it goes out of influence, it goes down to the minimum, which is 4, and as it passes through this, it goes to the maximum, which is 32. This is the basic concept of a field driver. It allows you to modify practically any parameter in Cinema 4D through the use of a field. In order to try out field drivers on a project, I created this. Here you can see a bunch of light rods that lie flat on a surface, and as that little light passes behind them, they raise up, and as they raise up, the light intensity gets brighter, and then when the light passes them, then they begin to fall back down to their flattened position with a much dimmer light. And this was created really with the help of field drivers. So let's take a look a little bit at how this field driver thing would work on something like this. So in this file, we see that we've got a null here, right here at the very edge of this cylinder. And then inside of that null, we've got an area light, which is right under it in the same exact coordinate space. And then we've got a cylinder, which the light is using as its mesh. Okay, and the color of the light is red. Okay, so what we want to do first is we're going to click on the null. Now, since everything is a child of that null, if we rotate that null, everything else beneath of it is going to rotate along with it. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to that null, and we're going to go to the coordinates, and under its rotation around the x-axis here, we're going to right-click it, and we're going to add a field driver tag to it. And there it is. You can see it right there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on that tag, and you can see for the parameters, we're affecting the rotation. Okay, so we're going to say 0, okay, on its minimum, and -30 on its maximum. Okay, so this field driver tag is going to go for a minimum of 0 degrees and a maximum of -30 degrees. So now we're going to go to its fields, and for its fields we're going to create what's called a box field. Okay, now here's how a box field works. Let me move this over to here for a second. So the way a box field works is that anything outside of the box is not affected by the field at all. Okay, and as things get inside of the box from any direction, the influence is going to start until it reaches this inner box where the influence is going to be 100%. Okay, and as it moves out, the same is going to happen. The influence is going to get less as it moves out of the inner box until it's out of the box, and there's going to be no influence there. So what we're going to do on the box field is I don't want this big inner box in there, so we're going to go to the remapping tab of the box field, and we're going to change the inner offset to 0. So now the influence is going to start from the edge all the way until it reaches the center of the box. Okay, so now the thing is that if we were to bring the box over this null over here, we can see that as soon as it enters the box right here, okay, it's going to start getting that influence, and it's going to start raising up, okay, until it's right over the cylinder. Then it's going to be at the full rotation, and then as the field starts leaving, it's going to go back down to 0. Like that, okay, or no influence. So now the cool thing is you can also, for example, take this box and make it wider. So this whole thing will happen more gradually if you want it to. Okay, so you can control the size of that field as well. So the next thing I want to control with a field driver is on the light itself. I want to control its intensity. Right now, actually to do this, I'm going to bring up my Redshift render view. Okay, and then I'm going to hit play or start rendering here in real time. And as you can see, very faintly, you can actually see this light because it's at a very low intensity. It's actually at a 0.25 intensity. So what I want to do is I want to right click on the intensity and give it a field driver as well. So now I've got a field driver controlling the rotation of the null, and I've got one controlling the intensity of the light. So what I'm going to do on the one controlling the intensity of the light, so I'm going to leave the minimum intensity at what it is at 0.25, and I'm going to make the maximum intensity to 4. Okay, so it's going to affect the light, the intensity of the light between those two values on the minimum and on the maximum. Okay, now for its fields, we're going to go over to its fields tab here, and there's no need to make another field here because we can just simply take this box field in and we can drag it into the fields, and we can use this one box field to control both values of the light intensity and the rotation of the null. So now, for example, if I were to take this box field over, let me move this over to here, and I start moving it over, we can see that as it's going over that thing, it's raising up that light, okay, until it hits it right over it. Now it's at its maximum intensity, and as it leaves from the other side, the light starts rotating down and going back to a very low intensity. Okay, and that's how it works. And basically, to get a different look, you can just copy this light over, and on the second light, for example, you can say, for example, make the color of the light, let's say yellow. Okay, and now, for example, if I were to move this box field over, you can see as it goes over the first one, it's lifting it up, and as it starts going over the second one, it's lifting it up, and you can get sort of this staggered look. And basically, with that in mind, that's how we created this clip right here. So field drivers in Cinema 4D 2025, a very powerful and interesting new way to control any parameter of any object with fields. I hope you're enjoying this look into some of the important new features in Cinema 4D 2025 so far. If you like this video and want to see me do more videos like these, please consider making a donation of any amount. I'll leave a link below. Now let's take a look at something else that's new in Cinema 4D 2025. In this example, we see a bunch of hardware being spat out from a particle emitter, and it collects in the saucer and sort of spills out onto the table. Let's take a look at how this was done and what exactly is new about it in Cinema 4D 2025. Okay, so here's the setup right here, and if I press play, you can see that there is an emitter up here. Okay, it's a little out of view here, but if I dragged it down there, you can see it. And it's spitting out these particles into this dish over here. And basically, these are all rigid bodies, so they react to gravity and they bounce off the edges of the dish as well as fall onto the table and things like that. So here's what's new about Cinema 4D 2025. In Cinema 4D 2024, when the new particle system was introduced, rigid bodies did not assume the velocity and the direction of the particles that were being generated. Okay? As soon as you generated the particles, which I will turn on the particles over here. These are the particles that are being generated. What would happen was that the rigid bodies would just fall straight down. So in this example, for example, if I were to take the emitter and if I were to up the speed to, let's say, 500 instead of 200, okay, we can, and I'll rewind this to the beginning, we can see that, you see, the speed of the particles is now causing the let me hide the little green dots, but is now causing the rigid bodies to go further outside of the glass. Okay, so it's reacting to the particle speed and direction. Okay, so basically, in order to set this up, by the way, if you wanted to see exactly how are you generating rigid body particles out of the emitter, okay, is that we can see that there's a cloner here. Let me turn off the cloner, okay, and there's also like a rigid body tag over here, and I can go over to the basic tab and let me not enable it. So basically what happens is that when the dynamics are disabled, you can see that it actually just shoots them out without any dynamics because they're not going to react to gravity. By the way, you'll see here that there's a vibrate tag on the emitter, which is causing it to vibrate in a sort of random way. Okay, now as soon as, like, for example, I take that rigid body tag and I re-enable it, you can see that now it's basically going to have the gravity and the rigid body dynamics and collision detection and all that on. And let's actually go ahead and make the emitter back down to 200 so that they fall inside of the plate. Okay, so that's what's new. It takes the velocity and speed of the particles as well as the direction. If I pointed it up, it would shoot up. If I point it down, it would shoot down. So as a result, the rigid bodies are inheriting those attributes from the particle emitter. So that's new in Cinema 4D 2025. Cinema 4D 2025 also comes with some updates and revisions to Pyro, Cinema 4D's awesome fire and smoke simulator. Suppose I make a sphere, okay, and we'll make it a little bit smaller. We will make it like maybe this big. And I right-click it and I give it a simulation tag and I give it to be a Pyro emitter. I make that to be a Pyro emitter. Now if I press play, then it will start the simulation system and some fire and smoke will be emitted from that simulator. And now fire and smoke will be emitted from that sphere using Pyro. Now, as in past versions, if we go to the project settings, over here, scene settings, and we go to the simulation tab under Pyro, we have the voxel size. So if we lower the voxel size, let's say to 3 or 2 or 1 or even less than 1, we'll get more detail in the fire. So the fire will be more. Now this is just a preview here. It's not what the fire is going to look like when it's rendered. But the smaller the voxel, the more detail is going to be in the fire. Now, if we take a look, for example, and we draw the tree structure, we can actually see the voxels. So, for example, if I lower down the voxels to, let's say, 1, okay, and I rewind and press play, you'll see that the voxels are going to be a lot smaller than they were before. Okay, so that's what the voxels are. So I'll raise this back up to 3 for now. And I will turn off the tree. Now, in Cinema 4D 2025, inside of the Pyro tag, we can see that there's a new emission type. Okay, there used to be surface and volume. And by the way, the difference between surface and volume is this. If you emit from the surface, you can have like a thickness amount, which basically gives you a thickness around the surface. So if I were to pull out my sphere from here, okay, you can see that there's a thickness of fire around that sphere, okay? And basically, if I were to go ahead and lower that thickness to, let's say, 5, right, and I run the simulation again, okay, you can see that the sphere is a little thinner. Okay. Now, the thing is, though, however, let me rewind. If I were to go ahead and, let's say, choose it to volume, you'll see that there is no thickness, because what happens is that there's no thickness on the fire. And so if I press play, you'll see that you actually see the cube there. So it's best when using volume to just turn off the cube. Okay, and then you'll see that it just emits from the volume like that. Now, which one should you use? Well, as a general rule, you can think of it this way. You can use surface when you're doing surfaces of things, like the surface of a car or the surface of a table or whatever. And then, you know, or geometry that's not enclosed. In general, or you can use volume, like in the case of a sphere or an object that is enclosed, you know, a volumetric type of object. That's the difference. But you know, it's up to you really. You might want to have a volume and you might want to put a thickness on it so you can switch it to surface. But that's the difference between the two of these things. Now, but if you notice that in the emission type, there's new ones. There's a sparse volume and sparse surface. Sparse volume and sparse surface. And basically, if you use, let's say in this case, sparse volume, from what I've understand is that the similarities are very similar. I mean, the outcome is very similar, but the sparse volume has a better memory management and better tree management structure. It's more efficient. I don't think you'll see much of a difference when you're dealing with small simulations, but when you're dealing with large simulations or huge Pyro simulations, then you should definitely use the sparse volume or sparse surface if you notice that your system is starting to choke up or go slower or whatever. I actually rendered out a test just to see what the difference is, and here it is. And as you can see over here, basically the difference between the volume and the sparse volume is very similar. You can hardly tell the difference. So you could either, leave it on sparse volume, or you could leave it on surface and switch it to sparse volume when you're noticing that things are starting to slow down, or if it's not giving you the look that you want. Another new feature that's been added to Pyro in Cinema 4D 2025 is if I go back to the project settings here and I go to the Pyro simulation area, there's this minimum substeps and maximum substeps, okay? And basically there used to just be one here. It was called substeps. So it is kind of useful actually, because first of all, let's ask the question is, what are substeps? So substeps are very useful, especially for fast-moving simulations. Okay, if your Pyro's whipping around or things are moving really fast, you're going to benefit from adding more substeps to your simulation. So I've rendered out an example of different settings of substeps here. So in this example, I've rendered this simulation with 1 substep, 5 substeps, and 10 substeps. And here they all are together. So you can see that each one has a different look to them, and it's up to you to choose the one that you like the best. So now back in Cinema 4D, we see that there's a maximum substeps and minimum substeps, where there used to be in earlier versions just a substeps. So what you can do is experiment with different substeps levels by setting both of them to be the same thing. For example, you could set them both to be 3, or both of them to be 5, or 8, or 10, or whatever. And then basically get the look that you want as far as your substeps are concerned. And then what you should do, let's say, for example, you liked it to be 9 substeps, for example. Then what you can do is you can lower the minimum to a low level, like 1 or 2 or whatever. And then it will adaptively choose the substeps based on what's needed as far as based on the simulation. And this way you can have what's called adaptive subsampling. And that's a new feature in Cinema 4D 2025. Another new addition to Cinema 4D 2025 is the ability to use the color mode when doing Pyro Advection of particles. So what you can do is when generating particles, you can actually have them advect by Pyro, which can be useful for all sorts of things. Like, for example, you might want to have sparks swirling inside of your Pyro simulation and have them move according to the Pyro advection of the particles. Let's take a look at this movie here, which is an example of using Pyro Advection, although I've hid the Pyro simulation altogether, so all you see is the particles. Now you'll notice that in this example, the color of the particles is being picked up by an image, sort of like a still life, which is being used to color the particles. So let's take a look at how that's done. So in this example, we can see that we have a plane here, which is this plane right here, okay? And basically, we've got a mesh emitter, which is one of the particle emitters here, mesh emitter. And the mesh that I used on the mesh emitter is this plane, so I dragged the plane inside of the mesh emitter. And I'm going to be emitting a rate of 50,000 particles per second, okay, with a speed of 0, until frame 30, which that's when I'm actually going to, I keyframe the amount of particles coming out to frame 36 to just trail off to 0 particles. So it's going to look something like this. So as you can see here, we've got particles being emitted until about frame 36, and then they stop getting emitted. They're just collecting on this plane. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, on the plane, I'm going to add a Pyro emitter, and we'll just set the emission type to surface. We'll just leave it at surface for now. You could do sparse surface if you want. I'll just leave it at surface for the time being. So what's going to happen is that if I hit play, you'll see that a Pyro simulation gets made. Okay, and there you have it. Let's check the voxels. The voxels are set to 3 centimeters. Okay, and basically we're going to, and I'm not dealing with substeps for right now. But the thing is that we have this Pyro simulation like that. Now, if in the particle group for the mesh emitter, if I go over here to the simulate menu and I choose Pyro Advect, okay, as one of the modifiers for the particles, I'll drag that right in the particle group. You'll notice that what happens is that the particles that we're emitting are being advected into the Pyro simulation. So that's already a useful thing because you can color those particles and make them look like sparks or whatever you want to do, okay? But what we're going to do is we're going to go back to the beginning. We're going to go to the project settings, which are Control D. Okay, we're going to go to the Pyro simulation, and we're not going to draw the Pyro. Okay, so we're only going to draw the particles. And that actually would look something like this. Okay, so now my particles are being drawn and advected. Now what I want to do, however, is I want to actually use an image. Actually, I don't really have to use an image. I can paint some colors on this as well by using a vertex color tag. So mind you, I'm not going to put a texture map on this. I'm going to be using a vertex color tag, which is going to color the vertices. So let's take a look at what the vertices look like. Let's just take a look at the Gouraud shading line, and you can see that this plane has a bunch of vertices on it. For example, if I click on the plane and if I go into point mode, you can see that there's just a lot of different vertices on this thing. So let's add a vertex color map to it. So let's go to the plane and let's right click it, and in other tags we're going to use a vertex color map. And the thing is that I can actually paint colors on here if I want to. Like, for example, I can paint a orange, and I can paint a blue, and do whatever I want to paint, and then and use that to color the particles from there. But in the vertex color map, I'm actually going to use transfer, and I'm actually going to use a field. Let me get rid of the freeze field because we don't need it. And we're going to use what's called a shader field. So we're going to choose a shader field, okay? And then for the shader, we're going to choose an image for that. And this is the image I want to use. It's like a piece of a still life, like that. So we're going to click open. And we see that what happens is that it's actually using that image to color the vertices. So like I said, this is not a texture, because if I click off of the vertex color map down to here, it disappears. You can only see it when you click on the vertex color map. But here's the cool thing that's happening in Cinema 4D 2025. If I go to the Pyro tag, and under where it says color, I choose color enabled. And then I'll click this little drop down arrow here, and where it says color map, I'll drag in this vertex map in here and then close it. And then I go to the Pyro Advect modifier in the mesh emitters particle group. And if I set color mode color, and now if I were to press play, you'll see that the particles are actually picking up the colors in the vertex color map. Let me hide the lines. And then if I press play, you'll see that all those colors are being lifted into the color of the particles from the underlying vertex color map. That's how you would use Pyro Advection with the new color mode that allows you to color your particles. Well, that's about it for this video. I hope you enjoyed our look at some of the important new features in Cinema 4D 2025. And if you have a few moments, please watch The Mind Machine on Tubi. I'd really appreciate it. Thanks a lot. This has been Joe Herman, and see you next time.